stop. Before you scroll past this, before you assume this is just another cookie-cutter Middle East story about fluctuating oil prices, dusty sanctions, or the usual military posturing we've seen for 40 years, I need you to understand something. I need you to see the thing that almost nobody in Western media is actually saying out loud. What is happening right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not a story about Iran. Iran is just the stage. It's the backdrop, the real drama, the one that will define the next decade of global power, your bank account, and the literal warmth in your home. Is a conversation happening between Washington and Beijing, and it is a conversation conducted not in words, but in warships, oil tankers, and the white-knuckle silence of two nuclear powers staring each other down, daring the other to blink first. Let's start with the hard facts. At 10 a.m. Eastern Time this past Monday, the United States military initiated a blockade of Iranian ports. Within hours, China's foreign ministry fired back, calling it a dangerous and irresponsible act that risks inflaming the entire region. Now, if you've been paying attention to Chinese diplomatic language over the last decade, you know they don't do casual. They don't use words like dangerous and irresponsible to fill space in a press release. That isn't bureaucratic noise. That is a flare sent up in the dark. The question every serious person should be asking right now isn't what China said. It's what China meant. To understand the stakes, you have to look at one specific number, 98%. Roughly 98% of Iranian oil exports are bound for China. Think about that. That isn't just a trade relationship. That is a biological necessity. That is a lifeline. That is the kind of economic dependency that transforms a diplomatic dispute into something existential. It's the kind of pressure that forces a government to make decisions it would rather never have to make. And this is happening just weeks before a massive summit between President Trump and Xi Jinping. Washington has launched a maximum pressure campaign that doesn't just squeeze Tehran, it threatens to shatter the fragile peace, the delicate détente that the administration has spent years cultivating with Beijing. This is where it gets genuinely terrifying. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow, jagged ribbon of water tucked between Iran, Oman, and the UAE. It's only about 33 miles wide at its narrowest point, but through that tiny throat flows 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That's 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas. When you see a ship passing through that corridor, don't just see a boat, see the economic oxygen of the world. It's the fuel that keeps the factories running, the hospitals lit, the food in your fridge cold, and civilization itself humming at its modern, complicated pace. And right now, the United States Navy has effectively parked itself in that hallway and said, "Nothing moves without our permission." The International Energy Agency is already sounding the alarm, calling this the worst energy shock the world has ever seen, worse than the 1970s oil crisis, worse than the fallout from the war in Ukraine. In the 70s, an embargo caused oil prices to quadruple. It led to lines at gas stations that stretched for miles and fuel rationing that humbled the most powerful economies on Earth. We are staring down the barrel of something even more systemic. Yet, if you turn on the news, the conversation is still being framed as a bilateral standoff between America and Iran. Two old rivals bickering over a map. It's not. It never was. Consider the math. 38% of the oil and 23% of the LNG moving through Hormuz is bound for Chinese ports. All told, that represents about half of China's entire seaborne oil supply. Half. Imagine someone putting a hand over your mouth and nose and telling you they're only regulating your breathing. You wouldn't see that as a policy adjustment. You'd see it as a death threat. That is why Beijing's language hardened so sharply on Tuesday. You don't blockade a waterway that carries half of your primary competitor's energy supply and expect them to treat it as a regional security measure. You are aiming at Tehran, sure, but the bullet is flying straight toward Beijing, and Xi Jinping knows it. Right now, China is sitting on 1.3 billion barrels in strategic reserves. That sounds like a lot. It's enough to keep them going for about 120 days. But 120 days isn't infinity. It's a deadline. It's a countdown clock ticking in the corner of the room. Every morning, the blockade continues, that clock ticks louder. And it's not just about the volume of oil, it's about the cost. China's independent refineries in Shandong rely on Iranian oil because it's cheaper, If they have to buy replacement barrels from elsewhere, the price jumps by $10 to $12 per barrel. Multiply that by millions of barrels across hundreds of days in an economy that was already starting to show cracks. It's a slow hemorrhage. It's a strategic bleed out dressed up in the language of geopolitical patience. And this is where the chessboard gets really interesting and where most commentators are missing the move. While the US is tightening the noose in the Gulf, Russia's foreign minister just touched down in Beijing. He didn't come for the tea. Moscow has already stepped up, publicly offering to fill the resource gap created by the blockade. Do you see what's happening? Every day this blockade continues, the Washington versus Beijing dynamic is evolving into Washington versus Beijing and Moscow. By squeezing Iran, the US is inadvertently acting as the ultimate matchmaker, pushing its two greatest rivals into a tight defensive embrace. When China says the Strait of Hormuz must remain an unimpeded international trade route, they are being diplomatically elegant. But beneath that polish is a jagged edge. China isn't just arguing for oil, they are arguing for the principle of free passage. To them, the strait isn't subject to American discretion. It's a matter of international law. If the US can decide who gets to use a global choke point today, who's to say they won't decide who gets to use the South China Sea tomorrow? This is about China's conception of itself as a sovereign global power. If you challenge their energy supply, you aren't just hitting their economy, you're challenging their right to exist as a superpower. We are already seeing the friction. China is threatening countermeasures against US tariffs, using words like malicious linkage. That is the rhetoric of a government that feels cornered. And a cornered power is a dangerous power. Think about this. On Tuesday, a Chinese-linked tanker, already under US sanctions, slowly sailed out of the Strait of Hormuz and into the Gulf of Oman. It moved right past the blockade. Beijing didn't hold a press conference. They didn't send a tweet. They just moved a ship through the water. It was a calculated act of defiance. It was a test of the US Navy's rules of engagement. The US strategy here is sophisticated. It's a trap designed to offer Beijing only bad options. Back down and let Washington win, confront the Navy directly and look like the aggressor, or wait and burn through reserves while the US gains leverage. But the problem with traps is that they assume the person caught in them will play by the rules. What if China decides the trap itself is the provocation they need to change the rules of the game entirely? If this continues, analysts are projecting oil could hit $150 a barrel. In an economy still reeling from fragility, $150 oil isn't just expensive gas. It's a systemic collapse. It triggers a domino effect. Fertilizer prices skyrocket, food prices explode, shipping logistics become unaffordable, and pharmaceutical supply chains begin to snap. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a choke point for oil, it is the jugular vein of modern civilization. The ceasefire we thought we had between the US and Iran is a ghost. We are operating in a theater where one panicked captain, one stray drone, or one misread signal can convert a political standoff into a kinetic reality, a war that no one actually wants, but everyone is prepared to fight. The tragedy of great power competition is that the most catastrophic outcomes are rarely chosen. They are stumbled into because everyone assumed the other guy would back down first. Right now, the variable that matters most isn't a speech from the White House. It's the pain threshold of the Chinese economy. How much economic bleeding is Xi Jinping willing to tolerate before he decides that silence is no longer a strategy? History tells us that every power has a breaking point where the cost of inaction finally exceeds the cost of direct confrontation. When that calculation shifts, the world on the other side will be unrecognizable. 33 miles. That's all that separates the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman. 33 miles separates $150 oil from the prices we have now. 33 miles separates a tense standoff from the geopolitical rupture of the century. And right now, within those 33 miles, the United States Navy and the Chinese merchant fleet are engaged in a slow, quiet, and terrifying test of wills. It's a test that the media has barely begun to understand, and that the rest of the world is watching with a creeping, nauseating certainty that the adults have finally left the room.